The Keddie cabin murders. It was the morning of April 12th, 1981, a Sunday. A 13-year-old girl named Sheila Sharp had spent the night at a friend's house just a few cabins down the road from where her family was staying. Nothing unusual about that. She was a teenager doing teenager things on a spring weekend in a tiny mountain resort town called Keddie, tucked up in the Sierra Nevada foothills of Northern California. Population, maybe a few dozen people at most. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody. That morning, Sheila walked the short distance back to Cabin 28, her family's rented cabin, to check in before starting her day. She pushed open the front door, and what she saw inside that small, ordinary living room stopped her cold in a way she would never fully recover from for the rest of her life. But before I get into what Sheila found, and I promise you, we are going there. If you are a fan of strange, dark, and mysterious stories, I want you to consider subscribing to this channel. And also, if you could just quietly sneak over to the like button, maybe slip into its house while it's sleeping, swap out its toothpaste for that numbing dental gel, and then just calmly walk away, that would mean the absolute world to me. Okay, back to Keddie. To understand what happened in Cabin 28, you need to understand what Keddie was in 1981. It was not a thriving place. It used to be. Back in the early 1900s, Keddie was a legitimate railroad junction town, a real community. But by the late 70s and early 80s, the railroad traffic had slowed, the economy had dried up, and the town had quietly caved in on itself. What remained was a collection of small rental cabins tucked between pine trees, populated largely by people who were down on their luck, people between chapters of their lives, people who needed cheap rent and didn't ask too many questions. Sue Sharp was one of those people. Sue was 36 years old in April of 1981. She was a single mother, recently separated from her husband, a man named Martin Sharp, whose departure from the family had not been peaceful. Sue had packed up her kids and moved them to Keddie, where the rent was affordable and the pace of life was slow enough that maybe, just maybe, she could get her footing back. She had 5 children living with her in that cabin. Sheila was 13, John was 15, Rick was 10, Greg was 5, and Tina, sweet, gap-toothed Tina, was 12 years old. The cabin itself was small, 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen. Not a lot of space for 7 people, because Sue also had a friend staying with them at the time, a teenage boy named Dana Wingate, who was 17 and was close with her son John. Dana had been hanging around the cabin for several days, the way teenagers do. Sue didn't mind. She was that kind of mom. The more the merrier, even when merrier meant crowded. By all accounts, Sue Sharp was warm. She was real. She was the kind of woman who laughed easily and cooked for anyone who walked through her door. She was struggling. Sure, single motherhood in a mountain ghost town with 5 kids and not a lot of money is nobody's dream scenario, but she was trying. She was doing the work, and her kids loved her. On the evening of Saturday, April 11th, 1981, the night before Sheila would walk back through that front door, the Sharp cabin was alive with ordinary noise. Some of the kids were watching TV. Dana Wingate was there. John Sharp was hanging around. Sue was in and out of the kitchen. Sheila asked if she could go sleep over at a neighbor's cabin, the Seabalts, just a short walk away, and Sue said yes. "Take your little brothers with you," Sue told her. So Sheila took Greg and Tina and walked them over to the Seabalts' place for the night. That meant that back in Cabin 28, it was Sue, John, and Dana. At some point that evening, 2 men showed up. Their names were Buck Norris and Martin Smart. Both of them lived in or around the Keddie cabins. Both of them were known to Sue and to the family. Buck Norris was in his mid-30s, a large, physically imposing man with a history of violence. Martin Smart was his friend, a man in his mid-30s as well, who had recently separated from his own wife, Marilyn, who also lived in Keddie. These 2 men were drinking buddies. They showed up at Cabin 28 that night, and nobody thought much of it. People drifted in and out of each other's cabins in Keddie all the time. What happened over the next several hours inside that cabin? Between the time those two men walked in and the time Sheila pushed open that front door the following morning is one of the most savage and still largely unresolved crimes in the history of California. When Sheila stepped inside cabin 28 at approximately 7:30 in the morning on April 12th, the first thing she noticed was that the TV was still on. It was playing to an empty room, or what she thought was an empty room. And then she saw them. Her mother, Sue Sharp, was on the living room floor. She had been bound, her wrists and ankles tied, and she had been beaten and stabbed with extraordinary violence. John Sharp, her 15-year-old son, was nearby, also bound, also the victim of devastating injuries. And Dana Wingate, 17 years old, someone else's son, a boy who just happened to be at the wrong place, was there too. All three of them were dead. Sheila ran. She ran to the Seabalt's cabin where her younger siblings were still sleeping, and she screamed for someone to call the police. And within the hour, Plumas County Sheriff's deputies were pulling up to cabin 28 in the quiet mountain morning, stepping through the front door and trying to make sense of what they were looking at. What the investigators found inside that cabin was the evidence of something not just violent, but prolonged and deliberate. The injuries to the victims were consistent with blunt force trauma and stabbing, and the bindings on Sue and the boys suggested planning or, at minimum, a controlled rage. Whoever did this had not been in a hurry. They had been in that cabin for a while. One of the things that struck investigators almost immediately was the younger children. Greg was 5, Tina was 12, and while Greg was found safe at the Seabalts, Tina was not there. She was not in the cabin, she was not anywhere. Tina Sharp was missing, and that was the detail that transformed what was already a horrific triple homicide into something even more disturbing, because now there was a missing child, a 12-year-old girl, who had been in that cabin at some point during the night, who had gone to the Seabalts with her siblings, and who had apparently at some point come back. Why did she come back? Did she hear something? Did someone bring her back? No one knew. The lead investigator on the case was a detective with the Plumas County Sheriff's Department, and from the start, the challenge was enormous. This was 1981. The forensic science available was primitive compared to today. There was no DNA testing, no digital footprint to trace. The crime scene was a small rental cabin in a remote mountain community, and the pool of potential witnesses was a few dozen people who lived in close proximity and who were, many of them, reluctant to talk. The investigators began working the cabins immediately. They knocked on doors. They took statements. They started building a picture of who had been where on the night of April 11th, and fairly quickly, a name kept surfacing. Two names, actually. Buck Norris and Martin Smart. Multiple people in the community confirmed that Norris and Smart had been drinking that evening. Multiple people placed them near, or at cabin 28. And Martin Smart's estranged wife, Marilyn, provided a statement that would rattle the investigation. She told detectives that Martin had come home in the early morning hours of April 12th, that his behavior had been strange, and that she had found a bloody knife. She had actually held evidence in her hands and had not immediately come forward. Buck Norris had a history, a serious history. He had prior convictions for violence. He was known to have a volatile temper, and in the days after the murders, his behavior was, by multiple accounts, erratic and aggressive. So investigators had two suspects, a body of circumstantial evidence, community corroboration, and a missing child. And then things began to get complicated. Because here's the thing about a small insular community like Keddie in 1981. Witnesses change their stories. People who live next door to each other, who share parking lots and borrow each other's tools and see each other at the gas station every week. They are not always eager to put a neighbor behind bars, even when they suspect what that neighbor might have done. Fear does things to people's memories. Some of the witnesses who had initially placed Norris and Smart at the cabin began walking back their statements, or softening them, or suddenly becoming less certain about timelines. The bloody knife that Marilyn had found It had not been preserved. It was gone. The chain of evidence for what little physical material they had was frankly a mess, partly because of the chaotic early hours of the investigation, and partly because this was a small, underfunded county department dealing with a crime of a scale they had genuinely never encountered before. Buck Norris and Martin Smart were never formally charged. They were questioned, repeatedly, but the case against them, as strong as it felt circumstantially, kept running into the same walls. Not enough physical evidence, not enough witnesses willing to lock in their statements, not enough of a paper trail. And meanwhile, Tina was still missing. For 3 years, the Sharp family and the investigators and the people of Keddie carried the weight of those two facts simultaneously. 3 people had been murdered and no one had been held accountable, and a little girl had vanished and no one knew where she was. Then, in April of 1984, 3 years almost to the month after the murders, a group of kids playing in a campground area near Feather Falls, which is roughly 50 miles from Keddie, found a human skull and a jawbone and fragments of other bones. They were Tina's. The medical examiner determined that Tina Sharp had been killed, likely around the same time as the murders in Cabin 28, and that her remains had been transported and left in that remote location. She had not run away. She had not been taken as a hostage. She had been murdered. And whoever killed her had driven her body to a place where they hoped it would never be found. The discovery of Tina's remains broke the case back open. It injected new urgency. It confirmed what investigators had suspected, but never had proof of, that whatever happened in Cabin 28, it extended beyond those walls. There was transportation involved. There was premeditation, or at minimum, a deliberate effort at concealment. And there was something else. Among the bone fragments recovered near Feather Falls, investigators found a clavicle, and on that clavicle was evidence of knife wounds consistent with the wounds found on the victims in Cabin 28. Same type of blade, same general pattern. It tied Tina's death directly to the cabin. Martin Smart, by this point, had left Keddie. He moved away in the months after the murders, which some investigators viewed as significant. He eventually died in 2008 without ever being charged. Buck Norris also died without ever facing a courtroom for what happened in Cabin 28. But the investigation did not entirely stall. In the years and decades that followed, investigators and journalists and true crime researchers kept pulling at the threads, and one of the most significant breakthroughs came not from forensic science, but from a piece of paper. Among the personal effects of Martin Smart, examined after his death and related to researchers over time through various channels, investigators and researchers uncovered what appeared to be a note or a journal entry written in Martin's hand, in which he appeared to reference what had happened at the Sharp cabin. The note was not a full confession. It was partial, ambiguous in places, and could be interpreted in more than one way. But to investigators who had spent years on this case, it read like a man processing what he had done. The working theory, and it is still a theory because no one has ever been convicted, is that Buck Norris and Martin Smart went to Cabin 28 on the night of April 11th, 1981. There may have been a confrontation that escalated. There may have been an element of this that was planned in advance. The exact motivation is still debated. But the names of the 2 men most investigators believe were responsible have never changed. What may have happened is this. Buck Norris and Martin Smart arrived at the cabin. At some point, the situation turned violent. Sue and the 2 boys were restrained, beaten, and stabbed. Tina, who may have been asleep in another room, or who may have returned to the cabin from the Seabolts, was taken. She was killed, and her body was driven out to the remote area near Feather Falls and left there. The younger children, Greg, age 5, were either asleep through the entire thing or were deliberately left unharmed. Greg has spoken as an adult about fragments of memory from that night. He remembers things. He doesn't always talk about what those things are. Sheila Sharp, who pushed open that front door as a 13-year-old girl and found her mother and her brother and her family friend dead on the floor. Sheila spent decades pushing investigators, pushing the media, pushing anyone who would listen to keep this case alive. She has advocated tirelessly for her family. She has never stopped. The case is technically still open. Plumas County Sheriff's Department has never closed it. And in 2016, investigators executed a search warrant at a property in Washington state connected to the family of one of the original suspects, recovering items they believed might be relevant to the case. No charges resulted. 43 years later, no one has ever been convicted of killing Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, or Tina Sharp. The two men most investigators believe were responsible are both dead. Sue was 36 years old. She had 5 kids and cheap rent and a whole life still to figure out. John was 15. Dana was 17 and just happened to be there. And Tina was 12 years old, and somebody drove her body 50 miles into the mountains and left her there, and it took 3 years for anyone to find her. That's the Keddie cabin murders. The Axeman of New Orleans. It's March 19, 1919, a Tuesday night in New Orleans. Pietro Lamonto is sitting at his kitchen table, finishing the last spoonful of his wife's red beans and rice. He wipes his mouth, leans back in his chair, and lights a cigarette. It's late, maybe 10 o'clock. His wife Rosa is already in bed. The neighborhood is quiet. The only sound is the faint jazz drifting up from somewhere down the block. He listens to it for a moment, stubs out the cigarette, and heads to bed. In the morning, the neighbors notice his grocery store hasn't opened. They knock on the door. No answer. They look through the window, and what they see inside that shop is something so grotesque, so deeply, irreversibly wrong, that several of them will never fully sleep through the night again. New Orleans in 1918 was a city absolutely bursting at the seams. It was loud and humid and chaotic. It smelled like the river and fried food and horse dung and cigarette smoke all at once. It was a city where jazz was being born in real time. You could hear it pouring out of every bar, every back alley, every open window on a warm night. It was also a city with a very specific immigrant community. Tens of thousands of Italian Americans, mostly Sicilian, who had come over in the late 1800s looking for a new life. They settled in a neighborhood called the French Quarter and the areas around it. They opened small grocery stores, bakeries, ice cream parlors. They built a tight-knit community. They went to the same church, spoke the same dialect, ate the same food their mothers had made back in Palermo. They had also brought with them, from across the Atlantic, a deep blood-in-the-bone distrust of the police. Back in Sicily, the authorities were not to be trusted. You handled your problems yourself, or you handled them within the community. So when something bad happened to you in New Orleans, when someone broke into your shop, when someone threatened your family, you did not automatically run to the cops. You stayed quiet. You dealt with it. This cultural tendency towards silence is going to matter enormously because something was about to start preying on this community. And whoever it was, they seemed to know exactly how to exploit it. The attacks started in the spring of 1918, May 22nd, 1918. A man named Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine are asleep in their apartment above their grocery store on Upper Line Street. Sometime in the early morning hours, probably around 2 or 3 a.m., a panel in their back door is quietly, methodically chiseled out. Whoever is doing this works slowly, carefully. There's no sudden crash, no alarm, just the quiet, patient work of someone who is not in a hurry. The panel comes loose. A hand reaches through. The door opens. In the morning, their neighbor, Joseph's brother Andrew, comes downstairs and finds the back door open. He steps inside. The shop is untouched. Nothing's been stolen. Nothing's been disturbed, but there is blood. A trail of it leading from the back of the shop, up the stairs, into the bedroom. Joseph and Catherine Maggio are both in their bed. Both have had their throats cut open with a straight razor. Joseph has also been struck, repeatedly, in the head with what appears to be a heavy axe. There is an axe, blood-soaked, sitting in the corner of the room. It belongs to Joseph. The attacker brought it from the shed. Joseph is dead. Catherine survives barely, but she will be completely unable to speak for weeks. She never gives the police anything useful. The police show up. They look around. They notice immediately that the panel in the back door was chiseled out. Someone came prepared. Someone knew what they were doing, and then they find something written in chalk on the sidewalk nearby. Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up tonight, just like Mrs. Tony. Nobody knows what it means. Nobody knows who Mrs. Tony is, or was. The chalk message is baffling and chilling and deeply strange, and it goes unsolved along with everything else. The New Orleans Police Department brings in a detective named John D'Antonio. He's an experienced investigator. Old school, methodical. He starts with the obvious suspects. The Maggio brothers, Andrew and Jake, both had motive. There had been some tension over Joseph's will. They were among the first people on the scene. Andrew's alibi is thin. D'Antonio brings them in. He leans on them hard. The brothers sweat through the interrogation, give slightly inconsistent answers about where they were that night. D'Antonio is convinced he has his men. He arrests them both. And then the second attack happens. June 28, 1918. 5 weeks after the Maggio murder, a baker named Louis Bessumer lives above his bakery on Dorgenois Street with a woman named Harriet Lowe. They are not married, which in 1918 New Orleans is itself a minor scandal. Nobody talks about it directly. But everyone knows. At around 8 in the morning, Louis Bessumer staggers out of his front door, bleeding heavily from a wound on his head. He's barely conscious. Neighbors run to help him. One of them rushes inside and finds Harriet Lowe on the floor of the bedroom, unconscious, her skull fractured. The back door panel has been chiseled out. An axe, Louis' own axe, taken from the shed, is found abandoned near the bedroom. Harriet is rushed to the hospital. Louis is patched up. He recovers quickly. Harriet lingers for weeks, and here's where things get strange. In those weeks, while Harriet is clinging to life, Louis Bessumer starts acting oddly. He's nervous, evasive. He keeps changing small details in his account of what happened that night. Detectives start poking around his background and find that Louis Bessumer is not exactly who he says he is. He's been living under multiple names. There are whispers. This is World War I, remember, that he might be a German spy. The NOPD, already under enormous pressure after failing to crack the Maggio case, decides that Louis Bessumer looks extremely suspicious. They arrest him too. And then Harriet Lowe finally regains consciousness. She's asked who attacked her. She looks at the detective, and she says clearly, Louis Bessumer did it. That's all they need. Louis Bessumer is charged with attempted murder. The case seems closed, and then on the exact same night, Louis Bessumer is formally charged. A pregnant woman named Annie Lowe is attacked in her home in a nearly identical fashion. Chiseled door panel. Her own axe taken from the shed. Her husband Edward is also struck. Annie survives. Their baby, born the next morning, premature and terrified into the world, somehow survives too. Edward Lowe is able to give the police a description. A large man, dark clothes. He appeared to be carrying an axe. That's it. That's all he saw before he lost consciousness. The NOPD is now in an embarrassing position. They've arrested 2 separate men for 2 separate attacks. Neither arrest has held up. The attacks keep happening, and the newspapers are starting to ask questions. Very loud questions. By August of 1918, the city of New Orleans is genuinely frightened. The newspapers, particularly the Times-Picayune, are running front-page stories with headlines like Fiend Attacks, Another Family, and Aches Murderer Still at Large. People are buying extra locks. Hardware stores are selling out-of-door reinforcements. Italian-American grocery store owners are sleeping with weapons beside their beds. Detective D'Antonio, under intense pressure, calls a press conference. He has a theory, he believes, and he says this publicly, that the attacker is connected to the Black Hand. The Black Hand was an extortion racket that had been targeting Italian-American businesses for years. You pay us protection money, or something bad happens to you. D'Antonio believes this is organized crime. The victims are Italian grocers who refuse to pay. The attacks are a message. It's a compelling theory. It fits the pattern. The victims are all Italian. They all own small shops. A lot of people buy it. But there's a problem, and D'Antonio knows it even as he's saying it out loud. No money was demanded from any of the victims. No notes. No threats beforehand. None of them reported anything to police, and the attacker never stole anything. Not a single coin from any of the cash registers. That's not how the Black Hand operates. The Black Hand wants money. This attacker doesn't seem to want anything except blood. The investigation stalls through the fall. The attacks pause. The city cautiously exhales. And then, in March of 1919, the Axeman comes back. That brings us back to Pietro Lamonto. March 10th, 1919. When the neighbors finally break down the door of his grocery store that morning, here's what they find. Pietro is in his bed, alive, barely. His skull has been fractured. He is unconscious and covered in blood. His wife is in slightly better condition, also in the bed, also struck with what appears to be a blunt instrument. The back door panel has been chiseled out. Pietro's own axe is found nearby. Pietro survives, but he remembers nothing. His wife, Rosa, also remembers nothing useful. The police are back to zero, and the city erupts. Because by this point, there have been 6 attacks, multiple murders. Not a single arrest that's held up. And the attacker has been so bold, so methodical, so utterly unafraid, that people are starting to believe something almost supernatural. That this person, this Axeman, the newspapers are now calling him that, can walk through walls, can appear and vanish like smoke, cannot be caught. And then on March 13th, 1919, the Times-Picayune receives a letter. The editor opens it and reads it, and then he reads it again, and then he calls the police, because the letter is from the Axeman himself. The letter is extraordinary. It reads, and I want to read parts of this carefully because it's genuinely one of the most bizarre documents in American criminal history. Hell, March 13th, 1919. Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a fell demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. He goes on to say that he is going to visit New Orleans again very soon. But then, and this is where it gets bizarre, he makes an offer. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I mention. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it on the Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Tuesday night, jazz music, or the axe. The city of New Orleans responds the way only New Orleans can respond to something like this. They throw a party. On Tuesday night, March 18th, 1919, every single jazz club, ballroom, and dance hall in the city is packed beyond capacity. People who had never been inside a jazz club in their lives are suddenly enormous jazz enthusiasts. Home parties spring up all over the city. Windows are thrown open. Gramophones are cranked up to maximum volume. The streets of New Orleans throb and shake with music. It is, by all accounts, one of the loudest, most joyous, most collectively terrified nights in the city's history. A local songwriter named Joseph Davila even writes a piece specifically for the occasion, the mysterious Axeman's Jazz, or Don't Scare Me, Papa. It becomes an immediate hit, and on that Tuesday night, no one is attacked. The newspapers declare it a triumph. The city feels an almost giddy relief. People laugh about it the next morning. Can you believe we all did that? Can you believe this city? And then, 6 months later, a grocer named Steve Boca is found in his home. His skull fractured, his back door panel chiseled out. The laughter stops. The attacks continue through the fall of 1919. Steve Boca survives. A woman named Sarah Lawman is attacked in her bed and left with severe head injuries. She is 19 years old, lives alone, owns no grocery store, and is not Italian. The Black Hand theory finally collapses entirely. Detective D'Antonio is exhausted and getting nowhere. The NOPD is being mocked nationally. And then, in October 1919, comes the moment that finally cracks the case open, though not in the way anyone expected. On October 27, 1919, a grocer named Mike Pepitone is attacked in his home. His wife, Esther, wakes up in the early hours to a sound she can't identify. She lies still, listening, hears footsteps in the hallway, then silence. She waits. After a long time, she gets up and opens the bedroom door. Her husband is on the floor of the next room. His skull caved in. The axe is beside him. The back door panel has been chiseled out. Mike Pepitone dies before dawn. He is the last confirmed murder victim of the Axeman of New Orleans. Esther Pepitone is shattered. In the weeks after her husband's death, she moves back to her family, tries to rebuild, and for a moment, the trail goes cold again. The attacks stop. And then, on December 2nd, 1920, more than a year later, a man named Joseph Mumphrey is walking down a street in Los Angeles, California. A woman in a black veil approaches him from behind. She shoots him 3 times. He dies on the sidewalk. The woman is arrested immediately. She gives her name, Esther Pepitone, Mike Pepitone's widow. She tells the police simply, "This man killed my husband, Joseph Mumphrey." The investigators who get on the phone with New Orleans start pulling his file, and what they find is remarkable. Joseph Mumphrey was a career criminal with a long arrest record in New Orleans. He had been in and out of prison his entire adult life. He had served time for burglary, for extortion, for various other crimes. And here's the thing. When investigators map out the dates of his incarcerations and compare them to the dates of the Axeman attacks, something almost perfectly clicks into place. The first wave of Axeman attacks began in 1911. Yes, there were earlier attacks before 1918, including the murders of 2 Italian grocers, the Crudi family and the Rossetti family, that the NOPD had never connected. Mumphrey was released from prison in 1911. The attacks stopped in 1913. Mumphrey was sent back to prison in 1913. He was released again in 1918. He was imprisoned again briefly in late 1918. The attacks paused. He was released in the spring of 1919. The attacks resumed. The correlation is extraordinary. It's not proof there were no fingerprints, no murder weapon ever definitively tied to him, no witness who could place him at any scene, but the circumstantial picture is overwhelming. Was Joseph Mumphrey the Axeman of New Orleans? Esther Pepitone certainly believed so. She told the investigators she had been watching him, tracking him for over a year. She claimed he had confessed to her directly, that she had confronted him, that he had told her what he did. None of that was verifiable. None of it was ever tested in a courtroom. Esther Pepitone was sentenced to 10 years in prison for the murder of Joseph Mumphrey. She was released after 3. She moved away from New Orleans and disappeared entirely from the historical record. The New Orleans Police Department never officially closed the Axeman case. They never charged Mumphrey posthumously. The letter to the Times-Picayune was never conclusively authenticated. the identity and true motive of the Axeman of New Orleans was never officially determined.